And who did we put on the axis of evil? Not the Taliban, not Al-Qaeda, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. You're next, we were basically saying. We're going to get you.
That's the voice of Barbara Slavin, director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are today's co-hosts, Alex Hall and Tom Collina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. This past Saturday marks the 20th anniversary of the attacks on September 11th, 2001. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the lives lost on this tragic day and the human cost of the post-9/11 wars.
Hi, Alex, and great to have you subbing today for Michelle. And yes, it is no exaggeration to say that the September 11th attacks and the U.S. response to it changed everything and had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy, including U.S. policy toward Iran, which we'll talk more about later in the podcast. I'd also like to acknowledge the passing of Philip E. Coyle. He was a renowned expert on U.S. nuclear weapons, missile defense, and so much else. For those who have been around for a while, you might remember the huge role he played while in the Pentagon in the Clinton administration, in that administration's decision not to deploy a national missile defense system in 2000. Phil, we will miss you. But back to the show. Alex, what do we have on for Early Warning?
Today on Early Warning, I discuss the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan with an Afghan human rights advocate. We talk about the effects of the past 20 years of war on Afghan civilians and also the impression that the U.S. and its allies have left on the country and its people. It is really a somber conversation.
And after that, I sit down with Barbara Slavin with the Atlantic Council to talk about the global war on terror and its opportunity costs. You know, we always talk about the direct costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But what about the impacts on U.S. policies and relationships, including how it affected the U.S.-Iran relationship or North Korea? So it's a great conversation, and please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback really helps us improve this show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Zubaida Akbar, an Afghan human rights specialist based in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining. As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. We are taping this about a week after the United States withdrew the last of its troops from Afghanistan, ending its participation in the 20-year war. Can you give us a sense of how your family, you, and your friends in Afghanistan are experiencing this?
The Afghan nation is feeling betrayed and abandoned as a result of this abrupt withdrawal. Because alongside with the international community, even more than the international community, the Afghan people made the biggest sacrifice during the 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Afghan people were in the front lines of fighting with extremism. For every little gain, they lost their loved ones, they lost their friends, they lost their family members. And now they feel like they have been walked out on and they have been abandoned at the hands of a terrorist group. So I think for me as an Afghan, for my family, and every Afghan across the world in Afghanistan, that main feeling that we are going through right now is feeling abandoned.
And here in the U.S., we've heard military and political leaders debate everything about whether this drawdown should have happened or how it should have happened. But what do you think from this debate is really missing?
I think what's missing from this debate is the true story of the war in Afghanistan, how it started, what it meant for the Afghan people, and what it meant for the international community, and what an abrupt and fast withdrawal resulted in. I think we are not talking about this in a self-critical way. We are not talking about it in a way that would by we, I mean the governments that were involved in Afghanistan, the international community. They are not looking at themselves and they are not questioning what they did wrong. They are even taking this opportunity to applaud themselves, to pat themselves in the back for doing what they did in Afghanistan. But for Afghans, for me as an Afghan, for the Afghan nation, the entire intervention in Afghanistan was a failure. We see that the world that came to Afghanistan and said that they were there to fight extremism, that they were there to protect the rights of women, were the first ones to give up and walk away. Right now in Afghanistan, the ones that are standing up and fighting are Afghan women. We hear about their protests every day. That's a testament to the fact that values of human rights, values of women's rights was not something that West brought to us. That's why it didn't walk away with them. Afghan women were fighting for their rights 20 years ago under the rule of the Taliban. They were running underground schools to educate girls. They were saying no to the Taliban in whatever way they could. They continued that fight during the past 20 years. So these values did not come to Afghanistan with the West. Yes, women had a stronger voice during the past 20 years with the support that they received from the international community. But that support means nothing now because the world has decided to walk away, and it's again up to Afghan women, and it's their resilience that's showing up these days. So I think what's important to note from this whole experience is that Afghan women never needed saving. The Afghan people never needed saving. We needed solidarity. And I think to come to a country with a savior behavior results in this, in what has happened in Afghanistan right now. Then you walk away, you give up, and then it's the people who continue the fight. And the fight won't stop. Afghan women will continue to fight. They will continue to raise their voices. They will continue to resist. But they're disappointed by the world because the people who once called themselves the saviors of Afghans are the first ones to run away and to abandon them.
What do you think it really would have meant to have listened to, or to now listen to, these Afghan voices?
We would have sustainable progress in Afghanistan, progress that would have lasted. And the sacrifices of the Afghan people would have meant something. Right now, the message that we are receiving from the world is that every Afghan woman, every Afghan human who lost their lives to make progress happen in Afghanistan, their lives are worth nothing. That it didn't mean anything for the world. And that if there is a moment for the world where they decide they can't do this anymore, they will walk away and they will care less. Right now, the world is not speaking about the resilience of the Afghan people. The narrative of the world about what happened in Afghanistan is very different from what we go through as Afghans every day. The world leaders tell us that Afghanistan fell because of lack of resilience of Afghans, because they didn't fight hard enough. But what we see every day is something else. Afghans are continuing to fight right now. It was not lack of resilience of Afghans that Afghanistan fell. It was the deals that were made behind our back with the Taliban, the deals that the US made behind our back with the Taliban. From the start of the US-led peace process and peace negotiations, every Afghan from across Afghanistan raised their voice about how naive it is to trust a terrorist group to make deals with them. Despite all of our sacrifices, we were willing to negotiate with the Taliban, but we didn't find our ways around the negotiation tables. We asked for the process to be inclusive, but it never happened. We addressed the world, we addressed US, we addressed the Taliban and asked them to allow us to sit around the negotiation tables with the Taliban. That didn't happen. We didn't see that happening. So it was not lack of our resilience. It was the world allowing the Taliban to rebrand themselves, to the world that provided the platforms for the Taliban to rebrand themselves, and the world that made deals with them. And then once they thought they had signed their deals and they were done, they walked away. They never listened to the warnings that we gave to the world. And even now, everything that we thought would happen happened. We told the world that the Taliban were a brutal terrorist group, that they have no respect for human rights no respect for women's rights, no respect for the rights of minorities. We see that happening. Right now, the Taliban are killing women. They're suppressing their protests. They are finding minorities, ethnic minorities, and killing them. They're attacking free media. And this is happening on the world's watch. And the world is still insisting that the Taliban have changed.
With all this in mind, what do you think comes next for Afghanistan, and what should or can listeners do if they want to help?
I think if the world wants to do something right now, especially world leaders, especially the international community, which I have as an Afghan living through the past 20 years and going through what happened in Afghanistan the past few weeks, I have lost my trust to their commitment to human rights issues. Despite that, if there is a willingness to change anything or to contribute to improving the situation in any way, I think the most important thing is to let the Afghan story to be told by Afghans, to let the true narrative of the war to come out, and to take responsibility for their part, for the international community to be truthful and honest about what went wrong, what they did wrong, and to allow us to tell the true story of our country. And the true story of our country is that we did not lose. We did not have a lack of will to fight. It was not our lack of resilience. The true story is that the world made a deal with a terrorist group. The world released 5,000 terrorists to fight in Afghanistan. The world legitimized a terrorist group. The world handed a country over to a terrorist group. That is the true story.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and the story of Afghan people.
Thank you for having me.
Join us Thursday, October 21 for Press the Button Live, Nuclear Policy in the Biden Administration and Beyond. 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, broadcasting live on Zoom. Every year, Plowshares Fund gathers partners in the nuclear policy community, members of Congress, and listeners like you who are eager to learn more about how we can reset nuclear policy and create a safer world for all. This year, we're adapting our annual Nuclear Policy Forum into our Press the Button podcast format for an inspiring and informative discussion. The virtual forum will be led by Plowshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher and Press the Button podcast co-hosts Tom Collina and Michelle Dover. Confirmed guests include Chairman Adam Smith of the House Armed Services Committee, California Congressman Ro Khanna, and many more to be announced. For more information and to register for this free event, visit plowshares.org.
This past weekend marked the 20th anniversary of the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And I think most of us can remember where we were on that tragic day. I myself was in my downtown DC office watching the news on TV. I remember walking home in a daze, afraid to use the metro out of fear that there might be another attack. And I've never looked at an airplane the same way again. It is no exaggeration to say that September 11 changed everything, most of all U.S. national security policy. President George W. Bush launched the global war on terror and invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq. Both wars ended in dismal failure. Iraq has long been recognized as one of the greatest blunders of U.S. foreign policy. And now Afghanistan and its war is finally over after 2 decades. Trillions of dollars and thousands of lives lost. And the Taliban, as we all know, is right back where we found it in Kabul 20 years ago. So on today's show, we want to look at the war on terror and its opportunity costs. In other words, how did the war on terror and its failings impact other U.S. policies and relationships? Take, for example, Iran, one of the most vexing foreign policy challenges we have today. As our listeners know, the Biden administration is trying to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal after President Trump withdrew in 2018. But the new leadership in Iran is delaying talks. So what might our relationship with Iran have been like if we had not invaded Afghanistan and Iraq? To help us explore this question, we have Barbara Slavin. She is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She is a lecturer at George Washington University, and she's the author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. She's a former journalist and a regular commentator on U.S. foreign policy and Iran, and she has traveled to Iran 9 times. Barbara, it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
So just to start us off, where were you on September 11th?
Well, I had just gotten into my office at USA Today downtown and turned on the little television that was in my cubicle. One of the planes had already hit. And this, I watched, as many did, when the second hit. I watched it live. And even after the first one, I sort of knew, but after the second, I was sure it was Al-Qaeda. And one reason I was sure was because 2 days earlier, the leader of the anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan was assassinated by Arab journalists, Ahmed Shah Massoud. And I'd had a big fight with my editor saying, this is a significant story. We should put it on page 1. There's another shoe that's going to drop. Boy, I had no idea how soon or how big that shoe would be, but I knew. And then the rest of the day was just a 14-hour blur. I've never worked so hard or so fast in my life, calling every source I knew on Al-Qaeda. Because I knew it was them. I knew it was bin Laden. It was a blur. My coworker gave me a lift home at about 10 o'clock that night. And the only other thing I do remember was looking out the window at one point during the day and seeing people running down the streets of downtown Washington, which I don't think I've ever seen before. And obviously they'd been told to go home and they were just terrified to get the hell out of downtown DC. But apart from that, all I remember was hunching over my computer and making phone calls and sending emails and writing.
And of course, you were ahead of the curve because most of us had never heard of Al-Qaeda. So you had to jump on the rest of us understanding what was really going on. So let's jump from that obviously early day 20 years ago to now, and looking back at the last 20 years, the wide breadth of it. What lessons would you hope that we as a nation learn from this experience?
Well, for me, I think one of the most upsetting aspects was the way in which George W. Bush declared the GWAT, the global war on terrorism. We were going to go after every terrorist group on the planet that had any international connections and any country on the planet that had anything to do with these terrorist groups. And, look, I don't think I'm necessarily that smarter than people in government, but whatever happened to divide and rule? If you declare war on all your enemies at once, you push them together, you create an impossible problem for your strategists. So, okay, Bush said, all right, we'll do Afghanistan first. But even from the first days after 9/11, people like Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz were pushing for Iraq to, if not be hit immediately, then soon thereafter. And of course, there were opportunities with other countries that sensed how vulnerable the United States felt, how wounded we felt. And there were immediate offers to help us from the Iranians. And they did help us. They helped us get rid of the Taliban the first time around because they were very much supporting the group that Ahmed Shah Massoud led, the Northern Alliance, and they had excellent intelligence. The Northern Alliance functioned as our boots on the ground. We sent in some CIA people. We used our air power. We had some guys on horseback who rode through the mountains of the Hindu Kush along with the Northern Alliance. We knocked off the Taliban, and then the Iranians helped us create a new government for Afghanistan immediately after. They were incredibly helpful. They even gave money. There was a big pledging conference in Tokyo. And Iran was one of the most generous donors to the new government, post-Taliban government in Afghanistan. So what do? We put them on the axis of evil. That awful speech that George W. Bush gave, his State of the Union, I believe it was, in late 2002. And he was so proud of that phrase, and Condi Rice was so proud of that phrase, and all the neocons loved it. And who did we put on the axis of evil? Not the Taliban, not Al-Qaeda, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. You're next, we were basically saying, and we're going to get you. And of course, this ensured that, we made the fateful decision to invade Iraq. We ruined our chances with North Korea, destroyed the agreed framework that had kept them from developing nuclear weapons for a decade. And we alienated Iranians and undercut all of those within the country who were arguing for a better relationship with the United States and who saw 9/11 as an opportunity to forge some sort of reconciliation with the United States. Just a colossal strategic blunder.
And you're reminding us that North Korea is a whole nother story that we need to talk about in this context, but we're not.
I've been to that place 3 times too. And we had opportunities with North Korea coming out of the Clinton administration, so you think how everything could have been different, if we'd had a relationship with Iran, if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, what would the world look like if we hadn't invaded Iraq? No Al-Qaeda in Iraq, no ISIS. I was just reading something by Ali Soufan, who's a very good analyst, that there are more jihadi terrorists now than there were 20 years ago. I'm sorry, that's a definition of failure. That's not a definition of success.
Right. And I think that goes right to things that Barbara Lee and others said right at the time, right? If we sort of treat this as an opportunity to go out and shoot more people, and we're just going to create more enemies. And it certainly seems like that's what we did. Now, you wrote an interesting piece recently where you talked about, some of the most consequential losses following September 11th, were the dashed opportunities with Iran, and you just mentioned some of them. Are there others? Are there other things that you would point to where the war on terror really led to a damaging relationship with Iran?
Well, the Iranians and the United States had back channel talks that grew out of talks about Afghanistan. And these continued with an interruption after the Axis of Evil speech, but actually continued for a couple of years. And the Iranians we used these to get them to turn over some of the Al-Qaeda people who had fled into Iran. And there were discussions because the Iranians were smart. After the Axis of Evil speech, they knew that Iraq was going to be a target. And Javad Zarif, who was then a deputy foreign minister, actually warned Zalmay Khalilzad, who was then a senior U.S. official on the National Security Council dealing with the Middle East and dealing with Afghanistan, warned that Iraq was going to be a complicated place. And the U.S. basically brushed off the Iranian concerns. And the U.S. also did something else that was very, very damaging. There's a terrorist group called the Mujahideen Khalq. This group was on the U.S. terrorism list at the time. It was an Iranian group that had broken with the Islamic Republic of Iran after the revolution and had found refuge in Saddam Hussein's Iraq and was carrying out acts of terrorism against Iran, sending people in to assassinate, police officials, things like that. And they had their base in Iraq, outside Baghdad, at a camp called Camp Ashraf. And in these discussions between Zarif and Khalilzad, there was an agreement made that the U.S. would perhaps consider turning over the leaders of the MEK for a few very high-profile Al-Qaeda types that the Iranians were detaining. Still, they had a son of bin Laden. They had a man named Saif al-Adil, who was the operational chief of Al-Qaeda, and they had them under what we called hotel arrest. It was fairly cushy, but they didn't have freedom of movement. And the Iranians held these guys as bargaining chips. So what happens? We invade Iraq. We poo-poo all the Iranian advice. We take Baghdad fairly quickly, which was a bit of a humiliation for the Iranians. They fought an 8-year war with Iraq and they never got close. And then we get to Camp Ashraf. And instead of putting this place under guard and arresting some of these leaders, we decided to give them protection. And there were people in the US government, and I wrote about this in my book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, people in the US government like Wolfowitz, who thought that you could use Doug Fife, another name from the past, who thought you could use this group against Iran in the coming US invasion of Iran, because Iran was on the list, let's face it. And there were people like Rich Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, and others at State Department said, no, but they were overruled, as they were when it came to the invasion of Iraq. So we lost this very powerful bargaining chip. We could have gotten key leaders of al-Qaeda out of the country had we been willing to do this swap. We also, Iran's on the axis of evil. We refused to talk to them. By this time, we knew that they had a nuclear program that was fairly well advanced. Bush administration refused to talk to them, and we sort of subcontracted this to the Europeans, to the British and the French and the Germans, who started a dialogue with the Iranians on their nuclear program in our stead. Precious years lost. We could have gotten the JCPOA much earlier, and with Iran at a much lower level of advancement in its nuclear program, if the Bush administration had had a different attitude toward Iran, if John Bolton had not been Undersecretary of State for arms control, or whatever the title was at the time. Of course, he was a big advocate and remains a big advocate of bombing Iran. This is one of his pet projects, and thank God Donald Trump didn't let him follow through with it when Bolton was briefly one of Trump's national security advisors. So it took years. It took until Bush's second term before he began to realize, and Condi and others began to realize, that maybe we have to talk to the Iranians because the war in Iraq is not going so well. And guess what? All of the various Shia Muslim groups in Iraq that Iran had nurtured, these are the same groups that we're relying on to try to start up a new government for Iraq. Iran, of course, won the war in Iraq and is firmly entrenched in that country today. That was our doing because there was really no one else that we could work with. There were these exiles. And of course, Iran had basically sewn up all of these exile groups, or almost all of these exile groups over the years, Kurds, Shia, and others.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the switching of the government there, we essentially removed a government that was very much opposed to Iran and installed one that was much more friendly. Tell us what the dynamics of that were and how we're sort of seeing that play out today.
Well, the most influential Iraqi exile was a man named Ahmed Chalabi, who has passed away since. And he was playing, look, he wanted to overthrow Saddam and he wanted to go back and be the leader of that country. And so he played a number of games. He was cozy with the Iranians. He was cozy with Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and all the neocons in the United States. He used to give what were called black coffee briefings at the American Enterprise Institute. Well, I remember them. He was supposed to be the George Washington of post-Saddam Iraq. And this guy was basically ratting us out to the Iranians. Everything we did, the Iranians knew about in advance. There were others, the Kurds in the north, who had to maintain ties with Iran for their own survival. So when we overthrew Saddam, who was there? We parachuted in pretty much. Ahmed Chalabi, I remember writing a big piece about him. He was a chubby little man, and he wore this sort of black commando tight black commando T-shirt, and black pants, and was parachuted in with the U.S. forces. And it was ridiculous because the Iraqis didn't accept him. But there were a number of them. There were, of course, people who had much more muscle behind them, like the Badr Brigade. They were a group that had been nurtured in Iran during the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War. They came in sort of following the tail of our logistics up, from Basra in the south up to Baghdad. They became entrenched and their leaders became very important. There were a variety of new groups that arose among the Shia, and the Iranians had ties with almost all of them, longstanding, much more longstanding than the U.S. ties. So when it came to forming a new government, I remember the first elections in Iraq. You remember the purple fingers? Everybody's so proud. I was actually in Iran during those first elections in 2005, and I went to the city of Qum, a city full of seminaries for Shia clerics. And there were a number of Iraqis there who were voting, and the Iranians had organized them to vote for the Shia list. And the same was going on, of course, in Iraq. So the people who were elected to the first parliament were all or largely people that were supported by the Iranians. And all of the prime ministers who've come since that time have had to have the Iranian seal of approval on them in order to take those positions. I know people want to say we liberated Iraq. Yeah, we did. And, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are very happy that Saddam is not there anymore. But we also delivered the country into the hands of the Iranians.
So let's finally talk about the Iran deal itself. As we mentioned, the Biden administration is trying to revive the deal, running into resistance with the new Iranian regime. Give us your sense of whether the deal can be saved and whether, the U.S.-Iran relationship is still suffering, and if so, how, from the fallout of the war on terror.
Yeah. Look, we had a recovery under Obama. We got this amazing agreement, and then we got Donald Trump. How many blows, can, and I write about some of the others in the piece. And of course, the Iranians are not innocent. And we have had hostage taking and terrorist attacks and other things that have been carried out. Iran is a very complicated country with many elements in it that are vehemently opposed to a relationship with the United States. So I'm not saying that if we'd done all of this differently, everything would be hunky-dory. It's just we had some opportunities. With the Trump withdrawal, though, from the JCPOA and now this new Raisi government, I think the chances are about 50-50 at best that we get back into the deal because Iran has learned to survive, if not thrive, despite maximum pressure, despite the sanctions. And Iran has a much stronger relationship with China, which has been another huge beneficiary of our war on terrorism. China has just scooped up economic opportunity after economic opportunity. And China has kept Iran afloat. And neighboring countries have kept Iran afloat. And there is a thought process that says, why go back into this deal when we can't count on the United States not to pull out again? What happens if Joe Biden isn't reelected or a Democrat is not elected in 2024? Do we have to go through this nightmare all over again? So I just, I hope that still perhaps the Russians, in particular the Chinese, can convince Iran that it will be easier for them to trade even with them if sanctions are lifted. And that it's important for Iran to uphold this agreement, which was, after all, codified in a UN Security Council resolution that the Europeans supported to at least to the best of their ability. But I don't know how many more chances we get. We've blown a lot of them. And we have vindicated those in Iran who say the United States is the great Satan. It can never be trusted. It is only interested in regime change, and there is no possibility of any kind of reconciliation with this country. And it worries me profoundly. It really does.
Barbara, we are out of time. We could keep talking about these issues for so much longer but I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop it there. But thank you so much for being here. I think we'll just have to have you on again to talk about all the different implications and ways that these issues connect and spiral together. But for now, thanks so much for your time. Best of luck with all your work, and until next time.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Plowshares, for all you do.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco. Research by Desiree Cepetis and Harry Tarpey. Audio engineering and sound design by Michael Padilla and the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.